Awesome. So our next speaker is Craig Fernandes, also at the University of Toronto, working on his PhD with Tim Chan. And he's also recently spent a bit of time as a research data scientist at Amazon, where he focused on inventory optimization. His PhD research focuses on optimization and machine learning techniques applied primarily to social good, healthcare, and sport decision problems. So Craig, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thanks, Luke. And thanks, Mark and Scott, for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right. So just as an introduction, so my name is Craig Fernandes, and as Luke mentioned, I'm a first-year PhD student being supervised by Timothy Chan at the University of Toronto. And so this work entitled The Markov Process Approach to Untangling Intention versus Execution in Tennis was work that I didn't, it was primarily made up my master's thesis that I graduated last month in August. And so briefly, just to highlight the research team. So Tim Chan, my professor, who's my supervisor, as well as Doug Fearing and Stephanie Kopelchik, both from Zealous Analytics. And so as some background, so sports analytics is long sought to answer, what is the best shot to take? And so I'm going to ground this presentation in tennis, of course. And so in tennis, what is the best shot a player should take? Aiming for the corner, aiming for the baseline, like what spin, what speed. The main issue, though, is that what is defined as best shot may be different for you and for me. So for example, let's say Mark and I are playing tennis, and I'm assuming Mark is a much better tennis player than I am. He can afford to do different shots that I can't even attempt, or I should not attempt. And the difference or the reason for this lies in our inaccuracy, or what I'm defining as my execution error. So again, execution error is going to be kind of similar to what Ethan was talking about earlier. And so just to be really clear about what execution means, is that I'm going to define these two terms very specifically. Error, which is a common tennis term, but just in general, is what I'm going to be calling losing the point. So I hit the ball out of bounds, I hit it into the net. Execution error, I have a specific definition of missing the intended shot target. So for example, I may still get the ball in play, I may still even win the point, but if I intended to hit it at a particular region of the court or particular location of the court, I can have an execution error of an inch, of 6 inches, of a foot, or a meter. And so different types or magnitudes of execution error, as well as different types. Maybe I miss more on a backhand compared to a forehand. And so much of the past literature has focused on the abstraction level of error. And like, how do we determine best shot, or the value of the player's shot selection based on their probability of erroring, whereas we want to focus on execution error. And so roughly, our research goal is to develop a framework that models execution error in tennis. Secondly, we want to do this so we can determine how different types and magnitudes of execution error affects the player's value. And then we can answer that question of what's the best shot to take. So we can determine optimal shot selection given a particular level of execution error. So obviously to do that, we need data. And so the data that we use is we used a simulator created by Kopelchik and her colleagues. And this generates 3D ball and 2D player trajectories. And it's been validated on Grand Slam data. And so actually currently Tennis Australia is using this generator to create one of their metrics in the Australian Open. So there's a pretty good confidence we have in the validity of this generator. And we denoted G, capital G. Each shot in the generator includes a prediction of when, error, or in play. So we know the outcome of the shot. And more powerfully, we can generate conditional shots. So each shot is generated independently, but we can say, generate a shot W from the generator G, given this vector gamma. So for example, I can say, generate me a shot, but I want the player A to start in this position. I want there to be a particular level of net clearance. I want an impact speed of X, and I want player B to be standing here at the time of the shot. And the generator will fill in all the gaps and generate me a likely shot. And so using this, I can generate a sequence of shots by first generating one shot, looking at the terminal conditions, where the players ended up, where the ball ended up, and then if it was predicted that it's still in play, I can then use those ending conditions as the starting conditions to generate a return shot. And like that, I can stitch together a point. And so with that, I can now talk about our modeling. And so we use Markov processes. So first we need to define the states. And so I define the state as the starting locations of player A and B, and the shot type, whether it was a serve return, or a rally. And there's two other states, whether we win or lose the point. And so here you can see the discretized court. 42 cells for player A's starting location, 42 for player B's. And it's really important to note here that when I'm talking about states or the model in general, I'm only concerned through the perspective of player A. So I care about the state of the game when player A hits the ball. And when player B hits the ball, I'm not concerned. I just want to know where will player A be when the ball comes back to him or her. So that's when the next state happens. So for example, let's say player A is standing in cell 8, player B is in 76, player A hits a rally shot. The next state will be when the ball comes back to player A, given that there wasn't a win or a loss at the point in those two shots. As far as actions, in each state, player A chooses where to aim. And this is what I'm calling their intention. And so this is one of the key aspects to our modeling approach is we define this action set. So for serves, it would be these 6 serves on the left side. And for serve returns and rallies, it could be these regions. And so in each state, so let's say player A is standing here, player B is standing somewhere here, player A has an intention distribution. And so this was fit on the data that we generated, that this is the likelihood based on that state, which action will a player aim for. And so these will all sum to 1. And now for each state intention pair, there's an execution distribution. So we talk about where they're going to aim, but that is different than where the ball will actually land up. And this is where the difference between intention versus execution comes in. And so we played around with different configurations of these actions, different models for the execution distribution and the intention distribution. But we found that bivariate Gaussians were formed a pretty good fit for how the ball actually ends up landing when aimed at these intentions. So for example, let's say a player was aiming at this region, MD6. This would be an example of one of the Gaussians that we fit on top of the data to show where the ball will actually land. And so you can see sometimes we can aim here, but the ball may land in a different cell, in a different action region. So with all that, we can now generate transition probabilities or start to simulate or model the game. So there's 6 steps to do that. So we first draw an intention A from the intention distribution. Now that we have that particular intention, we can look at the Gaussian that's fit on top of it and draw a landing location. Now using our generator and the conditional generator, you can say, I give it the state and the landing location and generate player A's shot. Looking at the ending of player A's shot, I can generate player B's shot, record the new state S prime, and repeat this many times to compute the probability transitions. Now, however, how do I involve epsilon? So first, or how do I involve error, execution error? First, I want to define perfect execution. And so as a definition, I'm defining this as when the ball's landing location matches the intention. So for example, that is where anytime I pick an intention, a player always gets the ball somewhere in that intention. That's a perfect execution. And so to do so, I needed to scale down the empirical covariances so that the 95% of the distribution's mass lay within the region. Now comes kind of the bread and butter of our approach is I can define epsilon to be a controllable parameter that models the level of execution error for each action A in state S. And this is introduced as this positive multiplicative factor on the covariance matrices. And so you can see that if I have a larger epsilon, I'm going to model a player with larger execution error, and these covariances are going to grow. And so now the likelihood that I sample a landing location different than where I intended is going to be higher as well. And so the way that this shakes up in the transition probabilities is now for every state and execution error level epsilon, I draw an intention, draw a landing location of this perturbed Gaussian, and then generate player A shot, player B shot, record the new state, and record these as the transition matrices for a particular epsilon. And so in this approach, only player A's skill level is varying from different levels of epsilon, where player B is always playing at the average level. So that's something that we'll see later on as well. And so just as a, to kind of talk about the magnitude of this approach is that in order to generate, sufficient transition probabilities and different scenarios of states and execution errors, we ended up generating about, I think it was 77 million shots. So computationally, this was a very expensive process. And one thing we note is that assuming professional players, we have a constant intention distribution regardless of the epsilon. And very quickly, as far as rewards, from the perspective of player A, reaching the winning state results in a reward of +1, any other state is 0. And so with all that, we can now get into what the actual model is, which are described by these Bellman equations. So we have 3 models. The first is the Markov reward process. And so here, the goal is to evaluate this randomized policy that corresponds to the constant intention distribution f of s, which we denote as pi hat. So basically, this is just following the empirical, what we saw in the data when players found themselves in this situation. This is where they normally aim the ball. Like, this is the distribution of actions. And so the way that we calculate this, I'm going to throw some math up on the board, is through this system of equations. And so briefly walking through it is, here I'm going to sum over all the different actions I can choose for. So for a particular action, what is the probability I end up in a new state S prime, given I started in the first state? And if I get to each new state S prime, what is the reward and value of being there? And so this is essentially just a very large system of equations, or linear equations. And I can solve that through simple linear algebra. And here we can interpret this as the V pi hat of S. So this equals the probability that player A wins the point when in state S using the empirical policy pi hat under execution error level epsilon. And so this is kind of a good way of evaluating a policy. But what if we want an optimization involved here? That's when we talk about a Markov precision process, or an MDP. And so here the goal is to compute the optimal stationary policy for each execution error level. And so here we have very similar equations to before, at least inside the brackets. We're adding this maximizer operator. So now we're saying, when you get to a particular state, what is the best action to take that maximizes my chance of winning the point? And I can grab this pi star as the optimal policy. And this is solved through policy iteration, and it converges actually quite quickly, just in a handful of iterations. And just to talk about how to interpret this, is now we're saying, before in the MRP, we had a distribution of actions that we can choose from in every state. Whereas now we're picking an optimal action in each state. So every time a player gets to a particular state, let's say, a configuration of where the players are standing, always choose the same optimal action. And so clearly there's a limitation to this, because no player would want to be fully predictable in their play, as well as the fact that these optimal actions are usually harder to execute. So I'm kind of not accounting for the fact that maybe I can't hit a drop shot on every single shot because of the difficulty of pulling that off. And so because of that, the results from the MDP are less realistic and actionable. And that kind of motivates our third model, which are these N1 period models. And so here, the goal is to isolate the impact of having optimal shot selection, not for every shot, not for no shots, but for one shot or two shots, etc., and then following the empirical policy. And so this is, for example, let's say I only want to be optimal on my serve. So I only have one action for my serve, the optimal action, but then every other shot, I'll follow this empirical distribution. And so mathematically, this is a policy iteration, starting with the empirical policy, but terminating after n iterations. And how does this actually shake out in the math is that, so for example, let's say n equals 1, we denote the policy pi 1 of epsilon as, first we follow the first decision rule, d1, which we define here, and then we follow the empirical decision rule. That's the same as pi hat. To get this d1, it's simply, what is the best action, given that if I take this action, I get to this new state S prime, but from that state onwards, I follow the empirical policy and the empirical value function, which is solely defined from the MRP, which I discussed a couple slides ago. And so this is kind of solved in a similar way to get the values, but we now have these three models, one to evaluate the empirical policy, one to get an optimal policy, and one where we can play with that's kind of in the middle of the two. So what were some of our results? So again, breaking it down by model, let's first visualize what the MRP looks like. And so the way to read this figure is player A is standing in the red cell, and when player B is standing in any one of these other cells, the value in it corresponds to the probability player A wins the point from that state. And so again, so in this example, player A has an epsilon of 1, so perfect execution, and player B has average execution, which I will talk about later in the next slide. But we can see here, for example, for this example where player A is here and player B is in this purple square, cross-court rally is a fairly neutral position. Player A still has an advantage of winning 73% of the time. However, if I drop the epsilon of player A to epsilon equals 13, which we compute elsewhere, that this is the average level, so we have other validation techniques to come up with this value, we see now we have two players of equal strength, average level, doing cross-court rallies, and the probability of winning the point dropped to about 50%. A pretty good sanity check that, yeah, no one really has an edge on this type of shot. And lastly, if epsilon increases to 20 and player A is now become worse than player B, the probabilities go down as expected. This is kind of, and I want to motivate this idea of how do we investigate particular types and magnitudes of execution error and how that affects our value. And so to do so, I need a catch-all metric. So that way I can summarize the value function with just one number. And so I define this as the probability of winning the point at the start of the point. So before it was probability of winning the point at each state. And so to get it at the start of the point, what I need to do is I compute the weighted average of the serving states and the serve return states. The reason I do this is that I can first of all summarize a vast variety of states in one number, and I don't need to consider the rally states because any dynamics that happen in the rally states will get funneled into one of these two buckets because every point will start with one of these two. And because we're basically equally likely to start as a server or a serve returner on any point, I can average these two values and I can get this final metric, which is the value of the starting state. And so now I'm going to explain the relationship between the two. So each scenario that I'm going to talk about starts with perfect execution and then begins to grow epsilon in particular states. So to walk through this image, on the y-axis, I have this catch-all metric, and on the x-axis, epsilon. And these are the different scenarios that I'm evaluating of where error is added. So all of them start with perfect execution in all states. And this bottom dark blue line corresponds to me adding error on every state. So this is the total error line. So you can see that as error increases, our value decreases. So as expected. We see here that for the rally shots, that if this has the greatest impact aside from the total error. So for example, to read this data point, this is saying that on all my rally shots, I have an epsilon level of 9, but perfect execution on serve and serve returns. And so we can see here how detrimental it is to error on our rally shots. Another thing that's interesting is to reading these two lines here. So this is the green, I'm going to call it the green line or the olive line, and the gray line. This corresponds to rally shots from the ad side of the court, and this is from the deuce side. And so given that 90% of the players in the set are right-handed, this kind of roughly corresponds to backhand rallies compared to forehand rallies. And so what we can interpret from this is that at the same level of execution error, it's more costly to have that error on a backhand. And again, a fairly intuitive finding, just given the fact that backhands in general are harder to hit. And so adding the same amount of error on backhands and forehands, we see this scenario just become, or this relationship be more pronounced as the error increases. Now I'm going to go through the MDP results. So first, I'm just going to visualize it, and I'm going to go through these slides a little quickly because here we see that when player A is standing here, player B is standing here, it's read the same way, except now I have an optimal action for that state. So again, we just see one action. And what I want to show is that look how high these values are. Player A almost wins with certainty if he or she follows the optimal policy. Even when epsilon equals 13, these values are still very, very high, even for epsilon equals 20. And so this is basically showing the limitation of the MDP, that when player A is playing optimally, it's not as realistic and it's not very actionable, because I don't think I can tell a player, when you get into this position, always choose MD4 as your action, because player B will start to pick up on that and play and adjust. But before we move on from the MDP, we can get one more insight from the optimal policy. So here in this figure, I plot the distribution of optimal actions at different levels of epsilon. And so here we see when epsilon equals 1, it's vastly more optimal to aim for the corners of the court. But so quickly as epsilon increases, does it become increasingly more optimal to aim for the middle of the court. And so how we interpret this is that if you have lower execution error, you can afford to be more aggressive. Whereas if you don't, if you error more often, it pays off to be a little bit more conservative. So another intuitive finding kind of backed by the optimal policy. Lastly, we're going to talk about the N1 period models. And so here, we're going to have a similar figure to one I had before, but now each line will depict a different pi n policy, n being the number of optimal actions I get and the type of optimal action. And so to walk through this figure, I have again, the catch-all metric here, the value of winning the point at the start of the point, the level of epsilon, and then different policies here. So first I want to point out the MRP and the MDP. So the MRP, the lowest line here, corresponds to n equals 0. I'm never optimal. And so intuitively, this is the lowest line, right? It's the least value I can get if I'm just following this empirical policy. Whereas the MDP stands for n equals infinity, where I'm always optimal. And again, so these serve as two very natural bounds, and everything else kind of falls in between. When n equals 1, let's say I'm only allowing a player to be optimal on the serve, the first rally shot, or the serve return, we see the biggest bang for buck if they're optimal on the serve return. And so the way we kind of made sense of this is that in general, the server has such an advantage on the point. He or she normally dictates the pace of the point and really has that advantage that if I'm able to be optimal on my serve return, I can kind of counter balance that advantage that the server has. And so this can be put into place by maybe if I'm playing a point, I exert the most energy on my serve return. I try the hardest to perfect my serve return. Or in my training and my practice sessions, I really focus on serve return, maybe a little bit extra because of its value and its like ROI, you can call it. And the last thing we see is that here we have, as the n grows, so here we have for number 8, when we're optimal on the serve return, and the first rally shot. So we have 3 optimal shots. Here are the first 2 rallies, so 4 optimal shots, 5 optimal shots. That yes, they are approaching the MDP as we expect, but we can see the gap is diminishing. So we have diminishing returns in our value as n increases. And so we can say, we don't need to be optimal. We don't need to exert so much energy on 5, 6, 7 shots. Just being optimal on 1 or 2, and even just the serve return really gives us a good return on our investment. And so in conclusion, we created this general modeling framework to study execution error and use Markov processes to back that. And our numerical analysis shows that backhand rally execution error is the most costly. Players with lower execution error can afford to play more aggressively, and being optimal on the serve return provides the greatest return on investment. And so future work could be definitely applications in other sports, especially ones that could really kind of better untangle the intention versus execution. Because I don't think we did a perfect job in this work, but there are some sports that lend itself a little bit more easily to that, as well as applications in game theory, kind of what I was mentioning before, of if we know the opponent's strategy, how will that affect the way that we have our optimal policy selection? And so thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Craig. I don't see any questions at the moment, but maybe I'll kick us off with a question of maybe it's not in the data, but I'm curious how you would think about different players having different shot velocities, right? Some players obviously have much faster serves or returns. Is that factored in? And if not, like, how would you think about incorporating that information?
Yeah, so in our state space, we only have the starting locations of the players and the shot type. The thing that we really, if we had the data to or the computational power to do it, would be adding some proxy for shot difficulty. And so we were hoping that would kind of capture the speed or the level of spin or different things about that, because that would, for sure, the optimal action when I have a shot lobbed to me is a lot different than when it's kind of pummeled at me. And so ideally, if we had the power to have the speed or include that in the state space, I think it would definitely make the policy a little bit more realistic and more actionable.
Yeah, that makes total sense. A follow-up, really elite level players presumably are going to have, the ones with sort of smallest execution error are also facing the most difficult opponents. And I'm wondering how you'd think about the opponents a player faces as impacting or biasing your estimation of a player's execution ability.
Sorry, could you repeat that last? How I lost the last.
Yeah, I presume, just to sort of oversimplify, better players have lower execution error, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And better players are also playing other better players.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how the fact that these good players are also playing tougher opposition might bias or impact our understanding of either the optimal policies or a given athlete's execution error.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say, as far as what our model did, is we assumed average level of professional players or Grand Slam caliber players. but I would definitely imagine that if I am a little bit weaker than the player, my execution error would grow proportional or inversely proportional to the strength of my opponent. And I think that's where either a two-agent model would work or some sort of game theoretical model would be better to get more player-specific characteristics. Because, yeah, I think as you point out, I would play differently depending on what types of shots I'm trying to return. And who knows, maybe that could be summarized with the shot difficulty in and of itself. Like that could be a good proxy for player skill as well.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. There are a few questions now in the Q&A. I don't know if you're able to pull those up.
Yep. Yeah, so for Stuart's question is empirically, how would you collect players' intent? This is essential for calculating execution error, isn't it? This was the bane of my existence throughout this project, is how do I really statistically prove this is where a player was aiming for? And so it wasn't something I touched upon too much in the slides, but that was where we went through a lot more of statistical modeling in the distribution fitting, as well as working really closely with one of the collaborators, Stephanie from Zealous Analytics, who has a lot of background in tennis of like getting domain knowledge to kind of intuit where a player might be likely intending the shot. But I think more work needs to be done in this. And so I'll point for one paper, which I remember reading and was very jealous of when I was reading this paper in the middle of this project, is there's a paper done on darts to kind of do this execution error and determine optimal policy. And in darts, it's very easy to intuit which region a player was aiming for, because you can very easily compute, okay, based on the score, you should aim for the 18 or like the double 12. And having that like precise confidence that this is the intention definitely gives better confidence in the execution error around it, or similar to Ethan's work where they have that experimental data where they knew where they were aiming. So there's definitely a little bit of intuiting. I hope that answered your questions, Stuart. So Kat mentioned, not sure if it was previously mentioned, but how was the grid plotted out and why those particular rectangles? So that's another great question. And we went through many, many iterations, if I can find it, of this plot. And basically what we looked at is when I made these iterations and then plotted the shots and then fit Gaussians on top of it, this ended up being the one that had the best fit, like best distribution fitting objective, and as well as kind of matched general intuition that net shots are going to be different than corner shots, and a sideline shot's going to be different than aiming for the middle. But again, it's definitely subject to change. There's no strong reason why we chose 45 here and you couldn't use 50. Barbara mentioned, does left-handed or right-handedness come into play at all, or does that simply get picked up in the data collection? So we know if the player is left-handed or right-handed, but we generate it just sampling from an average player. And so because 90% are right-handed, the data definitely skews more to a right-handed player, which is why we see that for that shots from the ad side of the court have lower value. We don't know that those are all backhand shots, but assuming that the majority is right-handed, we can kind of intuit that they're backhanded. And Ryan asked, apologies if I missed it, is there an actual empirical distribution that you used? And if so, what was the data source? And is the data publicly available? So the empirical distribution, so that the way that it works is that there was, I want to say 15,000 or 25,000 actual Grand Slam tennis shots that this generator was trained on and validated on and showed really good fit on. And so now that we have this generator that's been validated, that's being used in the industry, we now use this generator and say that this generator is like an average player, an average Grand Slam caliber player. And now we can generate at ad nauseum, basically, around 80 million shots. So that was where, but those shots are still are based on that empirical data. And so we can say that the interactions with the relationships in this data that we generated is mapping the real world. And it's currently not publicly available, not to my knowledge. That's why a big thank you to Stephanie and Doug from Zealous for allowing us to access it. But maybe in future days it'll be available.
Awesome, Greg. There is one comment from Paul in the chat. I don't know if you see that, so let's read it aloud. It would be interesting to investigate and/or incorporate increasing fatigue of players on their execution errors during a game and also through a tournament. I'm curious if you have any thought on that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Paul. I think it would be really interesting. And one thing that we were thinking about adding into the state space was an indicator on the shot number in the rally. An issue was that our generator doesn't provide that information. It just generates an independent shot. So I don't know how tired or not tired a player was when that shot was executed. But you would intuitively imagine that as the number of shots in a rally increase or the duration of the game increases, the execution error would grow. And so definitely something that I think would be interesting to look at.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Fantastic talk.
So I had a question.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I
raised my hand. That's all right. This is actually kind of in the spirit of Luke's first point about the velocity of the shots. I'm wondering if you ever thought about incorporating momentum of the player's movement in the state space. Thinking like if a player's stationary, their likelihood of success is probably quite different if they're, for example, on the move because they've just returned a very hard shot.
Yeah, so we toyed around with that idea, and the initial thought that when we were going to implement was, well, we were just going to have a binary classification of under stress or like stressed or unstressed shot, and we would kind of come up with some parameters or definition of, under stress is, did I have to cover a lot of ground to get to that shot, or am I off-footed when I get that shot? But with the generator giving us independent shots, we couldn't intuit that. But if we had the proper data from an actual game that we have every point sequenced in a rally, that would be something we'd want to condition on. Am I at rest, or did I just haul myself across the entire court and now I'm just trying to get a racket to the ball compared to really having sure footing? I think it would cause much different results.
Yeah, I was even thinking the direction is probably going to tell you something too. Just additionally to just under stress. Yeah.
There is one last and final question that just appeared in the Q&A.
With the intent to word it, how was it? So the question
you should probably read it out loud because it's not going to.
Was the type of shot considered along with the intent of where to play it? So in this initial model, no, we didn't know if it was a drop shot or had X amount of spin or not spin or a slice. So we didn't know the type of shot. We only defined an action as the landing location, which again is a very limited view of the shot for sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Greg. Fascinating talk.